So one method of animating in Photoshop is using keyframes. Before we talk about actually keyframing the animation, we want to go through a couple of steps and make sure that our Photoshop file is actually set up properly, because we need our layers to not only be labeled correctly, but in the correct order before we can begin animating. If you want to add something, but you've already started to animate, this can be a really big problem. So that's why we're going to take some time to set up our Photoshop file first. So I'm going to head over to my working file. We just viewed the finished practice file. So step one, we want to make sure that our layers are labeled. This is just good practice in general, and if you ever have to go back to your file after a couple months or years, it can be much easier to pick up where you left off if things are labeled correctly. So if you need to label something, simply double click on the layer text and then you can just type whatever you'd like. So we'll just type this, Great Britain, and then hit enter or return. Step two requires you to kind of think about how you want to animate your file. So you want to make sure that your layers are organized in the correct order. Obviously, being on the top does matter, but overall, you just want to think about, well, what's the easiest way to stay organized? So I set my layers to be, in this example, the area of countries first, because that is one group, then my speech bubbles, because that's another group, and then these red boxes with lots of text as the other groups. And finally, we have the political cartoon and just a white background. So again, obviously the order of the layers do matter, but we can think about how they're organized because I don't have a lot of things stacking on top of each other. In the event that I do need to change that, I can simply click and hold and then drag the layer to move it on top or below another layer. The third step is we really want to think about, well, how are we going to animate? What do we want animated? So in this example, we're having things fade in and out. So I might want to have all of these country layers fade in and out together. And so this step can be a little dangerous and a little tricky. So I could merge all these layers. So I'm going to click, and I can either hold Shift or the Command button. If I hold the Command button, I can select other layers individually. If I click one layer and I hold Shift and then click the bottommost layer, it will select all of those at the same time. Now, to merge these layers into one layer, I would then right-click and choose Merge Layers. Now, this is awesome because now all of these are on one layer, but the dangerous part of this is you can't unmerge things. I could physically go back in. I could select just France. I could right-click and say Layer via Cut. That would be the only way I could really undo the merging in this example. But let's say I wanted to get the text on its own layer from this text box. There would be no real easy way to do that. In fact, it would be faster and cleaner to simply just redo that. So be really careful when you merge layers. So I'm actually going to undo that because I don't want all of my country layers merged onto a single layer. So now our Photoshop file is really all set up. So again, my layers are labeled. They're in the correct order, and I thought about, well, what do I want merged? And I merged whatever I needed to. So now we can go to the timeline. If you see the little timeline tab in the bottom left, just double click it. If you don't see the timeline tab, click Window and then choose Timeline. So maybe my timeline has completely disappeared. I would just click Window, then I would choose Timeline, then it would be right there. So let's go back to the final animation real quick. And maybe we're just going to focus on how to do the first part. So I'm going to hit play. We'll notice that the animation starts with 2 seconds of white, and then it fades in to 2 seconds of just the political cartoon. So for the time being, let me just get rid of all of this other stuff. So this is what we want to focus on. 2 seconds, then a little fade action, and then 2 more seconds of the political cartoon. Now, let's just notice that I have the repeats set to forever. We can change that, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. So step one would be to only show just the white background. So I'm going to hide everything by clicking the eyeball to turn off everything except for the white layer. So I notice I have this keyframe right here. Think of it as a layer, but it's a layer for the animation. And we'll notice that by default in this file, it was already set to 2 seconds. I can click this down arrow and choose any amount of time that I want. So how do we keyframe animation? Well, the first step is to create a new keyframe. So you're going to click on this icon that looks exactly like the create new layer, but because we're in the timeline, we're going to create a new keyframe. So I'll click that. Notice it's the exact same thing because I haven't changed any of my layers. Well, for my animation, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to highlight the political cartoon, turn that layer back on, and we'll notice, well, the opacity is at 100%. So if I hit play, and because both of the times are set for 2 seconds, it's just going to very slowly go back and forth. So the first thing that I want to do is really make sure that my opacity is correct. And if we notice on this example, I have the opacity starting at 20%. And then for each keyframe, it simply goes up by 20 more percent. So again, 20. Then I have the next keyframe is at 40. The next keyframe is at 60, 80, and then 100. So how do we do that? Well, first things first, let's go over to the opacity. I will put it at 20% and then just hit enter. Now all I have to do is create new keyframe, bump it up by 20%, create new keyframe, and I'm just going to do that over and over again until I reach 100%. Now, I sort of randomly chose to go up by 20%. The reason why I did that is because it creates a nice fade, and then I don't use too many keyframes. I could have gone up by 1% if I wanted, but obviously then I'd have way too many keyframes to achieve the exact same thing. So here we go. 2 seconds. But 2 seconds now per keyframe. Well, that's not really what I want to accomplish. I want the fade to be nice and smooth. So in my final file, my fade is actually set to 0 seconds for the actual fading frames, and then it stops at 2 more seconds. So to do that, simply click on the 2 seconds, or that little downward arrow, and then choose no delay. If you want to select more than one keyframe at a time, click 1, again hold shift, they're all highlighted. Then if I put no delay, now all of them are at no delay. So let's look at our animation. So 2 seconds, fade to 2 seconds. That's exactly what I want. The last step would be, well, do I want it to repeat forever? 3 times once, I could have it repeat as many times as I would like. So for this animation, the pattern is quite simple. I have my different areas that fade in with 0 seconds of time in between the fades. Then when that group of stuff is finished, so this was a pretty big one because it was all the countries fading in, I had it stop at 2 seconds. Then again, we fade for 0 seconds in between, then it stops at 2 seconds. And so I just had this pattern repeat because I wanted it to look consistent and clean. That's how you set up your Photoshop file to do a keyframe animation with fading.